In this episode, we are going to write cool things that will be responsible to display more information about the game. Now, we are also going to handle some things that will help us to speed the game when we play it. So that's going to be cool things that we're going to write in order to improve our Minesweeper game that is quite working great until that point. So this will be the 5th episode that we are about to start, and if you will enjoy this video, please be sure to hit the like button and as well as subscribe to my channel so you will never miss the future episodes. And let's get started. So in this episode, we are going to design some functionalities that will be helpful to display more information about the game. For example, currently we know that there are 36 cells that are clickable, that we can click on, but now if I click here, we know that we have 35 cells that we can click. So we need to interactively display this kind of information in our window. That's going to be interesting to see how we can develop such a functionality. And in addition, we are going to develop a functionality that will be responsible to automatically open all the surrounded cells if the clicked cell length is 0, exactly like in this case. Because obviously, if we know that there are 0 mines surrounding this cell, then there is no point to not automatically click on this and that and this and that and that. So the reason for that is because there are always going to be 0 mines surrounding that cells, so to click on them is safe. So we are going to develop a functionality that will do this automatically for us, and it will improve the speed of our game. So let's go ahead and get started by developing everything that we just said here. Alright, so let's start with the second point that I have mentioned earlier, and that's going to be how to automatically open the surrounded cells in case we see the number of 0 when we click on some cell. So if we were to take a look in the left click actions, then you can see that we have a separation between a cell that is actually a mine to a cell that is not a mine. So here we can actually check if the clicked cell is not mine for sure, so this means that our code is going to be here, but we can also check if the display number is 0 or not. And the way that we can do this is by using the property of surrounded cells mines length, and we can verify if that is equal to 0 or not. So that's going to look like the following. So if self dot surrounded cells mines length is equal to 0, then we should do something. So if we are going to enter here, then we want to launch a for loop that will be responsible to basically display the mine's length for all the surrounded cells. Now we already know that we have a property that returns us back a list with all the surrounded cell objects, and that comes from here. So we are going to use this in that case for sure. So that's going to be like the following. So we can say for cell underscore object in self.surrounded cells, and we can go ahead and say something like cell object dot show underscore cell. Now if you remember, we have a method as well that is called show cell, which we call here. So it makes sense to try to open all the cells that are surrounded the clicked cell and also calling the show cell method for them as well, and that's going to work in case, of course, if the mine's length is 0. So let's launch the game and see if we have the expected behavior here. So the expected behavior here is if we click here and that displays 0, then the game should automatically open that and that and that. And let's see if we have this. So I'm going to really try to click here, and you can see that we have 2, so that's not a good test for us, and that's a mine, so we are looking for a 0, and you can see that this works perfectly. You can see that once I clicked on 0, then we got all the numbers that are surrounded the clicked cell in the first stage. So that's something that is going to speed the game and going to be extremely helpful, and let's continue from here. Alright, so now that we have done this, then let's go ahead and see how we can add some more elements to our window. Now we said that we'd like to display some more information about the game that we play. For example, information like how many cells left in the game in every situation. because every time you click on a cell, then the amount of cells that left decreases. So let's go ahead and show some text about that, because that's going to be helpful to see in what situation of game we are currently at. So the approach of that is going to be quite equivalent to what we have done with create button object. Now, if you remember, we used an instance method that goes ahead and creates a button, and then we go ahead and use this last line here, which is looking like self.cellButtonObject equals to btn, which will be the variable that has this button object stored. So we are going to do pretty much the same thing when it comes to display the amount of cells that left in the game. We are going to create a method that will create some text element in the window, and then we are going to call this method from the main.py file. And let's go ahead and start with this. So I'm going to go ahead and say def create cell count label. Now the reason that I'm using label, it is because the name of the class that are responsible to display just text without any special functionality is called label, and that's going to be the class that we're going to initialize. So that is the reason I can allow myself to call this function, I mean the method, the way it is. So we are also going to receive here another parameter that we can name location, and I'm going to go inside of it and I'm going to say label, or LBL to make it shorter, is equal to a label. Now we know that we do not import this, so I'm going to scroll here and I'm going to say from tkinter import button and label as well. And now that we have done this, then I'm going to pass in the location argument, and then I'm going to pass in some additional arguments. So this label element accepts a parameter that is called text, like we have seen with the button, and we can go ahead and say that its text could be a formatted string like cells left, and let's use a colon, and then I can go ahead and use something like the following. I can refer to the amount of cells that we already know from the settings. So settings dot grid size, and if I remember correctly, grid size stores 6 in here because we just set it to 6, and so it means that we have 6 times 6 cells. So it makes sense to also use here one more variable that we can name cell count, and that will be equal to grid size power of 2, like that. So we can go ahead and as well as replace this with that one, and that makes totally sense. And now I can go ahead to my cell.py file and replace this with cell count. Now things are looking a lot better. So now that we have done this, then let's go ahead and as well as return the label object that we have here. And now let's see how we are going to call this from the main.py file. Now there is something that is quite tricky with this method, and that is the fact that this label is not something that needs to be belonged to each of our cells, because that is a general information about the game. So what that means? It means that this cannot be an instance method, because this is just a one-time method that we want to call throughout the game. We do not want to call this method for each cell object. So that's why this needs to be a static method. And a static method is a method that is just for use case of the class and not for the use case of the instance. So that's why it makes sense to mark it as a static method. Now this also means that we should delete the self, because we do not need to receive the self if we do not use an instance method. So now it's safe to remove this from here and have a method like the following. Now if you never heard about static methods, then there's actually an episode about static methods in the Python OOP series that I published recently on my channel, so be sure to watch it at least for a couple of minutes in order to have a better understanding about static methods. Alright, so now that we have done this, then let's figure out where we are going to call this method. Now if you remember, for the button object, we basically used a statement that looked like the following. So we said that at the beginning, self.cellButtonObject is equal to none, and then we went ahead and we assigned this to a button object that is coming from here. So we are going to do the same thing for the cell count label, because that is going to be helpful when we need to make use of the cell count label from the main.py file. So now I can go ahead and create an attribute that's going to be belong to the class level, not to the instance level. And the reason that I'm doing this, it is because the cell count label should be something that is global, should be something that is not belonged to the instance level. So I'm going to go ahead and say cell count label is equal to none, and I can actually add here underscore object to keep the same convention like the cell button object. And now that I have done this, then I can change this thing here to something like cell dot cell count label object is equal to lbl, which is the variable name that we use. So that action is quite equivalent to what we have done previously throughout the series with the cell button object. And now that we have this, then we can go ahead and use this from the main.py like the following. So I can go ahead to here and I can just call this. So I'm going to go ahead and say a comment like call the label from the cell class, and this should look like this. So we can say cell dot create cell count label, and the location for that will be the left frame. Now left frame is the frame that is used to be stored in the left area of our window. Now if you remember, let me show you that. It's going to be right here in that location. So if I'm drawing here something, then this is the top frame, this is the left frame, and this whole area is the game frame, the center frame that we use it to play the game. So the widget that I'm talking about should be here. Alright, so let me clean that and close the game. Great, so now we call this method. So this means that I can access the label object by referring to cell dot cell count label object, and I can just use here a place in order to place this in somewhere in the frame. And let's start by placing this in 0, x equals to 0 and y equals to 0. Now if you remember, the numbers are relative to the frame itself, so this should be in the first pixel of the cell of the left frame, excuse me. So if I run the main.py file, then you can see that we have this here. Now I know that it is quite small and it needs some edit to make it bigger and nicer. So that's exactly what we are going to do now. So if we go back to the cell.py file and we go inside our static method which creates the label, then we can go ahead and increase the width and the height. So let's go ahead and use width equals to 12 and height is equal to 4. Exactly like the numbers of our button. And let's also give these attributes like bg, meaning the background color is equal to black, and we can use the foreground color parameter as well. So we can use fg is equal to white, and let's see what is going to happen now. So if we were to run the game, then you can see that this is not quite changing. So this means that maybe we need to increase the font parameter here. So we can go ahead and use font is equals to something like the following. So font by default accepts a tuple. So the first argument of this should be the font type. And you can go ahead and play around with your favorite fonts. And the second one should be the size of the font. So I'm going to start by size of maybe 48. Just to see if that's going to be too much, and that is. So I'm going to change this to maybe 30, and that looks just perfect right now. So I'm going to leave it as it is. This means that we can delete those attributes and continue from here. Alright, so now that we understood this, then let's see how we are going to interactively change the text every time that we click on a cell and the clicked cell was actually a cell and not a mine that finishes the game. So this means that we need to change the amount of cells left in the text that we have located in the left frame. So this means that we should be doing this exact action in the method that we have named show cell. And the reason that we want to do this here, it is because that is the perfect location that uses some actions when we click on some cell, and that is actually a cell, a regular cell that is not a mine. So this is the exact location that we look to take some actions when we want to display regular information about an open cell. So I'm going to use here a comment that will say replace the text of cell count label with the newer count, something like that. Now, in order to test this out, then I'm going to change this to something that is hard-coded just to see that we are able to do this successfully. So let's go ahead and test this out. So at first, it makes sense to check if cell count label object is none or not. And I can just do it the way it is. If cell count label object should be enough to test if this object is none or is filled with some information, meaning a label object. So if it is, then we want to go ahead and use cell count label object, and we want to configure its text to a newer text. So in order to test this, then let's go ahead and use changed like that and see how it is going to behave. If I am running that and clicking on a random location, then you can see that we see a change, and that is perfect. So this will be the way that this is going to work. Okay, so in that stage, let's try to understand what will be the most efficient way to store continuously the cells that are left in the game. So first things first, we could allow ourselves to store one more class attribute that we can name cell count. Now, we know that the cell count changes every time that the show cell method is being called. So what that means? It means that every time that show cell is being called, we could basically decrease the amount of cells by 1. So let me show you how this could look like. So we could go and scroll up and create here a class attribute that we can name cell count, which we can also allow ourselves to set this value to settings.cellCount. So it makes sense to at first have the value of 36, for example, for this class attribute. And we could continuously decrease this value every time that the show cell method is being called. So we could go here and use as the first line something like cell.cellCount minus equals 1, and this will be responsible to decrease the cell count by 1. And now that we are doing this, then we are also going to change the methodology that we store the text in the label that we have. Now, if you remember, we used to store inside the label information about the left cells, meaning the settings.cellCount. But now it makes sense to change the reference of that to cell.cellCount like that, because that's going to be the variable that we are going to decrease in every time that we click on a cell. So this means that having it like that is a better idea. So now I can allow myself to copy this and scroll down, and every time that show cell is being called, then I can configure continuously this text with the following information. So let me delete this from here and actually jump a line, and between those parentheses I'm going to say text is equal to exactly the same thing. And this needs to be configured every time a cell is being clicked, because we need to so-called refresh the information that is displayed in that label. So now that we have done this, then it is about time to test if that is going to work. Alright, so if we launch our main.py file, then let's see what is going to happen. So if we click here, then you can see that the amount here has been decreased. Now it could have been great if we will hit a cell that has 0 surrounded mines to see if that is going to work properly as well. So if we click here, you can see that this yet works great, and this is 34, 32, 33, excuse me, and you can see that here we have a mismatch, and that's happening because it thinks that it should also decrease the amounts for the mines that are here as well. Now, again, let me show you what happened here just right now. So at first we clicked here, here, and then here, right? And we saw a perfect behavior of 33 in there. But now we try to click here, but the game thinks that those cells should be opened as well. And that's why not only that it decreased to 32, it also decreased by 5 because it decreased the amounts for this and that and this and that and this and that, right? So it's important to handle this situation with something that we can do just right now because that is a bug in our game. So let's clean here and go ahead and see how we can handle this. So the way that we can handle this is by setting up an attribute that is going to be belong to each cell that we can name something like is_opened. Now is_opened is going to be a boolean type of variable that we can set by default to false, and every time that the show cell is called based on that cell object, we can convert this boolean variable into true, and that will mark this cell as being opened. And in that case, we can conditional our program to only decrease the cell count if the cell is not opened yet. So let's go ahead and design such functionality. So I'm going to scroll up and I'm going to say here something like the following. I'm going to say self.is_opened, and I'm going to set this to false because in the beginning of the game it makes sense to say that each cell is not opened yet. And now that we have done this, then every time that we use the method of show cell, then right after we finish all of our functions, then we can go ahead and say something like self.is_opened, is equal to true, like that. And let me use a comment here that will say mark the cell as opened, use it as the last line of this method. Something like the following should be enough to explain why we are doing this right here. So now we can allow ourselves to do something like the following. We can say if self.is_opened, and we actually want to test if that is not opened. So this means that I'm going to add here not. So this is going to check if the cell is not opened yet, and if that is the case, then I want to indent everything inside this conditional, because the only case that I want to execute this and as well as those lines is in the case if the cell is not opened yet. So that is perfectly making sense to use the code the way that we use it just right now. So now that we have done all of this, then let's test now if our game is going to behave as expected. So I'm going to execute this main.py file again, and I'm going to try to click on that one, and that is a mine, so it makes sense that the cells left is not decreasing because we should be finishing the game in that case, but we did not want to do that because it will interrupt our development process. So let's actually try to execute our game one more time and try to play the game like it needs to be played. So you can see that now we see 2. So let's try to not click here, to not face with a mine. Try to click here. So this is 34, still works perfect. 33, and that's a mine. So let's give it one more try. If we click here, okay, perfect result, because you can see that we have now 9 cells opened, and this is decreased by 9. So let's test if that is going to continue working. Great. So if we click on those 3, then those are pretty safe because we have a 0 here. So 26, 25, 24, and you can see that this works really perfect because once we clicked in here, it only decreased by 2, and those 2 were for this one and for that one. So now we have a great game going on without any bugs, and we handled a lot of things that could lead to trouble in the future. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed in this episode. In the next one, we are going to configure some things that will be responsible to mark this cell as a candidate for a mine, so we can have some different color to maybe differentiate between really cells that we clicked and to those cells that we think that they are mines but we don't want to click on them. So that's going to be cool functionality that we are also going to write, and that will be in the next episode. So again, if you enjoyed in that one, please hit the thumbs up button. It is going to help a lot to take this series to a better place on YouTube, and see you next time.